I knew somebody had messed with me before I even stepped out of my car, because the spot under the big cottonwood tree looked wrong. Not empty exactly, wrong. Like when you walk into your house and a chair has been moved 3 inches and your brain notices before your mouth does. There was a square of dirty asphalt where my truck had been sitting for almost 5 years, one little puddle of oil underneath like a signature, a couple of brown leaves sliding around in the wind, and my 1997 Ford F-150 was just gone. Now, that truck was not pretty. Let me get that out of the way before anybody starts picturing some restored classic with shiny chrome and a patriotic sunset behind it, because that old Ford looked like it had been personally insulted by every winter since the Clinton administration. The paint used to be blue, at least according to the title, but by then it was mostly sunburnt grey. The tailgate had a dent shaped like a boot. The driver's seat leaned a little to the left, and the radio only worked when it was raining, which made absolutely no mechanical sense. But I had stopped asking questions about that truck a long time ago. My name is Caleb Monroe. I was 44 at the time, living in a place called Briarwood Crossing outside Springfield, Missouri. One of those apartment communities that like to call itself luxury because the front office had fake marble counters and a coffee machine that broke twice a month. I worked maintenance for a commercial refrigeration company. Early mornings, long drives, greasy hands, honest pay. The kind of job where your truck is not a lifestyle accessory. It is your legs, your locker, your lunchroom, and sometimes your only quiet place in the whole day. That F-150 had belonged to my older brother, Luke, before he passed. And I know that sounds like the part where the music gets soft, but it is true. He bought it used, drove it into the ground, taught me how to change brake pads in our mother's driveway. And when cancer took him quicker than any of us were ready for, his wife handed me the keys and said, "Caleb, he would want you to keep it running." So when I say I stared at that empty parking spot like somebody had punched a hole through my chest, I am not being dramatic. I honestly thought it had been stolen at first, and for about 30 seconds I was already picturing some teenager joyriding it into a ditch or stripping it for parts, which would have been tragic because the parts were barely worth stealing. Then I saw the sign, brand new, bright white with red letters, bolted to a metal post set in a little island of fresh concrete beside the curb. Resident permit parking only. Unauthorized vehicles, subject to immediate tow. Immediate. That word sat there like it was proud of itself. I walked closer, still holding the gas station coffee I had bought on the way back from visiting my mother in Joplin. And I remember thinking, no chance, because that sign had not been there Friday afternoon. I knew it had not been there because I had parked in that exact spot after work, backed in, crooked like always, got out, kicked a crushed soda can away from the tire, and there was nothing there but weeds, cigarette butts, and a sprinkler head that had not worked since Easter. No sign, no notice, no flyer on my windshield, no email from management, nothing. But now my truck was missing, and that fresh little sign was standing there like it had been appointed sheriff over the weekend. I went upstairs first because I did not trust myself to walk into the leasing office carrying the amount of anger I had in my body. That is something age teaches you. By the way, at 25, I would have gone in there loud, swinging words like a tire iron. At 44, I knew better. I put my duffel bag down, set my coffee on the counter, took 2 slow breaths, then started making calls. The leasing office answered first. A young guy named Trevor who always sounded like he was apologizing for being awake. I told him my truck was gone, and he said, "Oh yeah, parking enforcement started this weekend." I said, "Trevor, I live here." He said, "Right, but the HOA board approved a new visual compliance policy." Visual compliance. That phrase nearly sent me into orbit. I told him my truck was not a painting in a museum. It was a vehicle registered to a tenant. And he lowered his voice like we were discussing a hostage negotiation and said, "You probably need to call the patrol vendor." The patrol vendor gave me the number for the towing company. The towing company was called Black Ridge Recovery, which sounded less like a business and more like a place Batman would investigate at midnight. A woman picked up after 3 rings and said Black Ridge in a voice so flat it could have slid under a door. I gave her my plate number. She typed for a second, and then she said, "Yep, we have it." Just like that. "Yep, we have it." Like I had misplaced an umbrella. I asked why it was taken, and she said unauthorized residential parking. I said I was authorized because I lived there. She said that was between me and the property. Then she gave me the number, $3,260. Cash or cashier's check only. Storage begins tomorrow at $85 a day. I actually laughed, not because anything was funny, but because my brain refused to accept the sentence in good faith. I said, Mom, that truck is worth maybe $4,000 if the buyer is generous and slightly drunk. She did not laugh. She said, Sir, do you want the address or not? That was the moment the whole thing changed for me. Not when I saw the empty space, not when I saw the sign, not even when I heard the fee. Changed when I understood they were not confused. They were calm. They were practiced. They had built a little machine where panic went in one side and cash came out the other. And regular people like me were supposed to be too tired, too busy, or too embarrassed to fight it. I drove out to their yard that afternoon in my neighbor's minivan, because my neighbor, Denise, was the kind of woman who smoked on her balcony in pink house slippers and somehow knew everything happening within a 3-building radius. She said, Honey, they got Marcus from building C2 and that little nurse from 214, and I think they're targeting older cars. That sentence stayed with me. Targeting older cars. The impound lot sat behind an industrial road, past a tire shop, a scrapyard, and a diner with 3 letters burned out of its sign. There were rows of cars behind chain-link fence, all of them baking in the heap like evidence nobody cared about anymore. Inside the office, a man with slick black hair and a silver belt buckle slid papers at me without looking up. I asked who authorized the tow. He smiled just enough to show one gold tooth and said, Your fancy HOA people have been real busy cleaning house. Cleaning house, like my brother's truck, was trash. I paid because I needed my truck for work. Because sometimes paying is not surrender. Sometimes it is buying time. But when I climbed back into that old Ford, when I smelled the cracked vinyl and old motor oil and the pine air freshener that had stopped freshening anything in 2019, I put both hands on the wheel and felt something settle in me, something colder than anger. They had mistaken quiet for weakness, and that was going to be their first real problem. I drove that truck back to Briarwood Crossing slower than I had ever driven it in my life, partly because I was still mad enough to make bad decisions, and partly because every rattle in that old Ford suddenly sounded personal, like even the truck knew it had been disrespected and wanted to limp home with dignity. When I pulled into the lot, I did not park somewhere else to avoid trouble. I parked right back under that cottonwood tree, in the same spot, nose straight, tires inside the lines, like I was putting a flag in the ground. Denise was out on her balcony with a cigarette in one hand and a mug in the other. And she called down, They give it back? I held up the receipt. She squinted and said, Good Lord, did you buy the truck again? That made me laugh for the first time all day, but it was the kind of laugh that had no joy in it. I went upstairs, laid that receipt on my kitchen table, and stared at it like it was a crime scene photo. 3 tons and $260. Administrative fee, hook fee, gate fee, after-hours processing fee. Even though I had picked it up at 2 in the afternoon. Compliance verification fee. That one almost impressed me. They charged me for verifying a compliance problem they had invented. I made coffee even though it was close to 7 at night. Opened my laptop, pulled my lease out of the drawer where I kept tax papers and old warranties, and started reading. Not skimming, not rage scrolling, reading. Every clause, every addendum, every little sentence printed in that tiny landlord font that seems designed to make normal people give up. And about 40 minutes in, I found the first crack. Under resident parking privileges, the lease said registered tenants were granted continuous access to unassigned residential parking areas unless a vehicle was abandoned, inoperable, blocking emergency access, or creating an immediate safety hazard. My truck was ugly, but ugly was not on that list. Then I found the second crack. Any new parking restriction affecting existing residents required written notice from management, not the HOA, not a vendor, not some guy with a reflective vest and a tow truck. Management, minimum 5 business days. I sat back in my chair and said out loud to my empty apartment, You arrogant little idiots. The next morning, I called in sick, which was not exactly a lie because my stomach was full of acid and my blood pressure probably sounded like a snare drum. I went to the county clerk first, then the municipal code office, then the public records counter at City Hall, which had fluorescent lighting so bleak it could make a birthday cake look guilty. I asked for towing enforcement regulations, signage rules, complaint records on Blackridge recovery, and any permits related to new parking signs at Briarwood Crossing. The lady behind the glass, miscellaneous, had grey curls, purple glasses, and the calm, terrifying competence of someone who had survived 30 years of local government paperwork. She looked over my forms and said, "Parking dispute." I said, "More like legalized kidnapping with invoice formatting." She smiled without showing teeth and said, "Honey, that is still a parking dispute until the paperwork says otherwise." Then she started helping me find the paperwork. By lunchtime, I had learned 3 things. First, any new HOA signage on residential property had to be posted for 7 full calendar days before enforcement could begin, unless there was an emergency obstruction. Second, the sign near my spot had been installed late Friday evening by a subcontractor called HOA Property Services. Third, Blackridge Recovery had been cited twice in the last 18 months for improper authorization forms and premature towing. That last phrase, premature towing, sounded polite enough for a church bulletin, but what it meant was simple. They had been taking cars before they legally had the right to take them. I drove back to the complex and started photographing everything: the sign, the concrete, the tire marks, the angle from the curb, the absence of older notice signs, even the bulletin board outside the mailroom where management usually posted announcements about pool closures and pest control. Nothing about parking, nothing about permits, nothing about towing. Denise came downstairs when I was crouched near the concrete with my phone and said, "Caleb, you look like a man investigating a murder committed by a signpost." I said, "I might be." She told me Marcus from Building C paid $1,100 to get his Honda back, and the nurse from 214, whose name was Priya, had a car taken after a 12-hour hospital shift. That changed something in me. Up until then, I was angry because they took my truck. After that, I was angry because they had found people who could least afford chaos and treated them like easy money. I knocked on Marcus's door first. He was a single dad, worked nights stocking grocery shelves, and he looked embarrassed when he talked about it, like being robbed by a towing company somehow reflected badly on him. He showed me his receipt, $980 plus storage, and said he did not fight it because his kid had school and he needed the car back. Priya showed me hers through cracked open door while still wearing scrubs, eyes red from exhaustion. She said the tow driver told her, "Take it up with the HOA." Sweetheart. That word, sweetheart, came out of her mouth like it still burned. By Tuesday afternoon, I had copies of 4 receipts, 6 written statements, photos from 3 angles, screenshots of the lease, the city signage rule, and one very interesting email that Trevor from the leasing office accidentally forwarded me when I asked for clarification. The email was from the HOA president, Grant Whitlock, to property management, subject line, Parking Appearance Initiative. In it, Grant wrote that older vehicles were creating a negative impression near the front buildings and that immediate enforcement would help reset community expectations. Older vehicles, negative impression, reset community expectations. There it was, plain as day. This was never about safety, never about access, never about residents abusing parking. This was about Grant wanting the place to look wealthier than it was. And my truck, Marcus's Honda, Priya's tired little Kia. All of us were clutter in his brochure fantasy. Now let me tell you about Grant Whitlock, because every neighborhood like this has one. He was not rich, not pretty, but he performed rich with the dedication of a community theater actor who thought Broadway might still call. Tarn loafers, tight sweaters, cologne you could taste from 6 feet away, always standing near the leasing office with one hand in his pocket like he was waiting for someone to photograph him for a developer magazine. He had made comments about my truck before, little smiling comments that came wrapped in politeness and smelled like judgment. Caleb, the city, still keeping that antique alive. Caleb, ever think about upgrading to something more in line with the property? Once, when I was unloading tools, he said, "You know, curb appeal affects everyone's investment." I told him, "Grant, this is an apartment complex next to a vape shop and a drainage ditch. Let us not pretend we are guarding the gates of Versailles." He did not like that. I think that was the moment he started seeing my truck as a personal insult. Tuesday night was the HOA meeting, and I almost did not go. That is the honest truth. I sat in my kitchen looking at the folder I had built and felt that old familiar tiredness settle over me, the kind working people know too well, where justice sounds great in theory but sleep sounds better. My brother's keys were hanging by the door, and I looked at them for a while. Luke had been the kind of guy who would argue with a vending machine if it kept his dollar, not because the dollar mattered, but because wrong was wrong. I could almost hear him saying, "Going to let a man in loafers steal your truck money?" So I put on a clean shirt, grabbed the folder, and walked to the clubhouse. The room went quiet when I came in. Not movie quiet, real-life quiet, where people pretend not to stare and absolutely stare. Grant was at the front table beside 2 board members and a property manager named Sheila Barnes, who looked like she had already decided this evening would damage her week. Grant smiled, the HOA smile. The one that says procedure is my weapon, and I have read the bylaws twice. Caleb, who said, "Resident comments are at the end of the meeting." I said, "That works, but legal exposure usually does better near the beginning." A few people turned around. Sheila blinked. Grant's smile tightened. He said, "If this is about your vehicle, Blackridge handles towing independently." I walked to the front, placed the folder on the table, and said, "Then you are going to hate page 1. I opened it and laid out the lease clause, the city rule, the photo of the fresh concrete, the installation record, the receipts from other residents, and the email with parking appearance initiative printed across the top. Grant reached for the email first, which told me everything. Not the law, not the receipt, not the photo, the email. His own words scared him more than anything else in that room. He said, "This is being taken out of context." I said, "Great. Put it back in context for everybody. Explain why older vehicles were targeted for immediate enforcement before the legal notice period expired." The room shifted. You could feel it move from gossip to danger. One board member, an older man named Frank with hearing aids and the permanent frown of a retired accountant, picked up the city regulation and read silently. Then he looked at Grant and said, "Did council approve this?" Grant said, "Blackridge assured us their process was compliant." I said, "Blackridge has 2 prior citations for this exact behavior." Sheila closed her eyes for half a second, and I almost felt bad for her. Almost. Grant tried to laugh and said, "Caleb, nobody targeted you personally." I leaned forward and tapped the email. "Grant, you wrote older vehicles were creating a negative impression. My truck was towed less than 12 hours after a new sign went up in fresh concrete. Marcus's car was towed. Prayer's car was towed. Every vehicle taken was older than 15 years. That is not enforcement. That is a shakedown with landscaping." Somebody in the back made a sound like they were trying not to laugh. Grant's face turned pink around the collar. He said, "You need to be careful making accusations." And that was the moment I stopped being polite. I said, "No, Grant, you need to be careful, because complaints are already drafted for the City Enforcement Office, the State Consumer Protection Division, and the Attorney General's fraud intake. And copies of this folder are going to a local reporter who has been asking questions about predatory towing since last spring." That room went so still I could hear the soda machine humming in the corner. Grant looked at Sheila. Sheila looked at the folder. Frank looked like he wanted to retire all over again. And I stood there with my brother's keys in my pocket, feeling the strangest mix of rage and peace. Because for the first time since I saw that empty spot under the cottonwood, they were not talking down to me anymore. They were measuring the size of the hole they had dug. The meeting ended about 7 minutes after that, which was funny because HOA meetings at Briarwood Crossing usually had the stamina of a hostage situation. People could argue 40 minutes over mulch color and still ask the public comment. But the second real liability walked into the room wearing work boots. Suddenly everybody remembered they had families to get home to. Grant tried to adjourn like it was his idea, like he was still in control of the room. But his voice had lost that little country club polish, and Sheila Barnes, the property manager, gathered the papers in front of her so carefully it looked like she was afraid they might explode. I did not yell. On my way out, I did not threaten anybody in the parking lot. I just picked up my folder, looked at Grant and said, "You have my number," then walked home under those yellow clubhouse lights with my heart beating so hard I could feel it in my teeth. And here is the part nobody tells you about standing up for yourself. It does not feel heroic right away. It feels exhausting. I got back to my apartment, sat on the edge of my bed, and for a few minutes I wondered if I had just made my own life harder. Maybe they would retaliate. Maybe they would start inspecting my balcony, my trash can, my tire pressure, whatever tiny rule they could weaponize. That is how these people keep power, not by being right, but by making resistance feel like a second job. But then Denise texted me a photo from her balcony. It was Mile Ford sitting under the cottonwood tree, ugly as sin, proud as a courthouse, and underneath the picture she wrote, "Luke would have loved this." I never told her how much that hit me. Wednesday morning, the call started. First came Sheila, using the voice people use when they are trying to sound helpful without admitting guilt. Caleb, we are reviewing the circumstances around the parking enforcement transition, she said. I said, good. Make sure you review the part where residents were charged thousands of dollars under an illegal notice period. She paused and said, we are hoping to resolve this amicably. I said, so am I, Sheila. But amicably does not mean quietly. 10 minutes later, Blackridge Recovery called. Not the flat-voiced woman from before, not the gold-toothed guy from the yard. This was someone named Mr. Balperm, and he had the smooth, nervous voice of a man who had just learned emails can become evidence. He said there may have been a miscommunication regarding authorization timing. I said, there was no miscommunication. You took vehicles before the sign was legally enforceable. He said, we rely on property representatives for authorization. I said, great. Then you and Grant can argue over which one of you stepped on the rake first. By noon, an attorney called on behalf of the HOA, a man named Daniel Keene. Polite, careful, expensive sounding. He kept saying phrases like potential misunderstanding and administrative irregularity, which is lawyer language for please do not say theft where a jury can hear it. He offered to reimburse my towing fee. I told him no. He offered reimbursement plus $200 for inconvenience. I laughed, not loud, just enough for him to hear how far away he was from reality. Daniel, I said, your client helped create a system that took working people's cars, charged them emergency money, and hoped they would be too tired to read the rules. I am not selling that back to you for $200 and a handshake. There was a long silence. Then he asked what I wanted. I had written it down the night before because I knew anger makes people ramble, and I did not want to ramble. I wanted a full refund for every resident towed under that sign before the 7-day notice period expired, compensation for lost work time and unlawful impoundment, termination of Blackridge Recovery's contract, written parking policy changes requiring direct resident notice, and the signed statement that no vehicle could be removed for appearance standards unless it was actually abandoned, unsafe, or violating a written lease term. Daniel sighed like I had asked him to rebuild the moon. Caleb, that is a substantial list, I said. So is $1,360 cash for my brother's truck. Thursday was ugly behind the scenes. I know that because people started talking. Briarwood was the kind of place where secrets did not travel fast. They traveled instantly, especially when Denise was awake. By lunch, she had heard that Frank, the retired accountant, had demanded an emergency board review. By 3, Trevor from the office accidentally told Marcus that Grant had been removed from direct communication with vendors. By 5, Pryor texted me that Blackridge had called offering her a refund if she signed something. I told her not to sign anything without reading it twice. Then I sent her the number of a legal aid clinic Miss Elaine at City Hall had recommended. That part mattered to me. I did not want to become the guy who got his own check and left everybody else in the burning building. Friday afternoon, I got called into the leasing office. Sheila was there, Daniel, the attorney, was on speaker, and Grant was not in the room, which told me more than any apology could have. On the table sat a folder with settlement papers and a check. My refund was included, plus damages, plus compensation for missed work, plus written confirmation that Marcus, Priya, Promistish was URA, and 2 other residents would receive reimbursement under the same policy review. The total for me came to $11,400. I looked at the check for a long time. Not because it made me rich. It did not. Half of it was already mentally assigned to bills, truck repairs, and replacing the savings they had raided from my life, but because it proved something I needed proved. They could have done the right thing before I built the folder. They chose not to. The folder made them. Sheila slid a second document across the table and said Blackridge's contract has been suspended pending termination. I said, pending? Daniel cleared his throat from the speaker and said, effectively terminated. I said, put effectively in the trash and give me the real word. By Monday they did. Blackridge lost the property. Then 2 nearby complexes quietly cut ties when the local reporter started asking why so many cars had been towed under newly installed signs. A month later, the city opened a broader review. 6 months later, Blackridge shut down at Springfield Yard, and nobody from that company ever called me sweetheart, sir, or anything else again. Grant resigned from the board for personal reasons, which is rich because nothing about that man was personal unless it had a logo on it. I saw him once after that at the mailroom, wearing sunglasses indoors, pretending to check his phone. He looked at my truck, then looked away. I wanted to say something clever. I had a dozen lines ready, but I did not. I just walked past him, got into that old Ford, turned the key, and of course the engine coughed twice before starting, because even in victory, that truck had to keep me humble. These days, I still park under the cottonwood tree when the spot is open. The sign is still there, but now there are notices posted beside the mailboxes, clear rules, actual timelines, and a little line at the bottom that says residents must receive written notice before enforcement. Every time I see it, I think about how small power gets when somebody asks it to show paperwork. And I think about Luke too, because that truck was never just a truck. It was the thing they thought looked cheap, the thing they thought made the property less valuable. But in the end, it was the reason their little scheme got dragged into daylight. So I will leave you with this. Was I petty for pushing it as far as I did? Or was that the only way to stop people like Grant and companies like Blackridge from doing it again? If your HOA or property manager took your car, charged you thousands, and hid behind policy, would you pay and move on? Or would you build the folder and make them regret every signature? Drop your take in the comments. Because I promise you, every neighborhood has a Grant. Every town has a Blackridge. And the only thing they fear more than bad publicity is one tired person who finally decides to read the fine print.